Beneath this historic Cincinnati neighborhood lies a forgotten underworld.
We found tunnels that have been sealed up for over 100 years.
What does this vast subterranean maze reveal about the city's past? Thousands of miles away, overlooking the Baltic Sea, a secret underground Danish fortress carved into a cliffside. What pivotal role did this concealed stronghold play during the Cold War?
This really is on the front line.
And located just below this major waterway in Liverpool lies one of the UK's most significant engineering achievements.
Nobody had seen anything of this scale before.
Beneath our feet lie extraordinary subterranean spaces.
We're miles away from civilization down here.
Caves, mines, and networks of tunnels.
The jewel in the crown for underground technology.
Some designed and built by humans. Others formed by nature over millions of years. How were they created and adapted? By whom and why?
If the enemy takes one section, he's not able to stand down there and shoot into the other section.
Throughout history, life underground has captured our imagination.
It creates very frightening but also very beautiful experience.
Now we're taking you further and deeper.
There's all kinds of wild theories about what could be below.
To unearth the mysteries, the secrets, and the wonders of these underground worlds. Lurking beneath downtown Cincinnati are remnants of Ohio's best-kept secrets. 9 meters below the streets is a network of abandoned tunnels and caverns, revealing the rich history of the neighborhood above.
The magic of Cincinnati is right down these steps.
Who built this underground labyrinth and why was it abandoned?
All of this industry and all of this culture starts to collapse all at once.
How are the tunnels now being revived?
Being able to get a piece of living history, it just fills me with joy.
For decades, Cincinnati has been a thriving metropolis above ground. But what makes this historic city unique is what's hidden below. In the 1830s and 40s, hundreds of thousands of German refugees fled to the United States, hoping for a life free from repression and inequality. In Cincinnati, they settled in the historic Over-the-Rhine district, and they brought with them their most treasured product, beer.
The United States is often referred to as a nation of immigrants.
Julie Carpenter is an architectural historian specializing in the region's illustrious past.
By the time Over the Rhine was fully developed, the neighborhood was between 60 and 75% German. You see a lot of buildings that have German language on them. What we know as Republic Street today was originally called Bremen.
Cincinnati already had an established brewing industry, but the newest residents added something distinctly German.
For as long as there have been people in Cincinnati, people have been brewing beer. The earliest breweries were run by English, Irish, Scottish, and they were making traditional English-style beers, ales, and porters.
While the English breweries remained above ground, the German ones relied on subterranean chambers to craft their innovative concoctions.
So we're walking into the fermentation level of the Jackson Brewery.
Mike Morgan is Cincinnati's resident beer expert.
This room looks huge and cavernous now, but it would have been packed with fermenting beer in the 1800s. Huge wooden vats going up and down both sides of it. The only real difference between a lager and an ale is that lager yeast requires cool temperatures to ferment, and ale yeast ferments at room temperature.
At their peak, nearly 35 breweries were producing more than 150 million litres of lager per year. As demand grew, local business owners had to dig additional tunnels and cellars to accommodate production.
All these lagering cellars have two levels. And on the upper level, they would ferment the beer, and on the lower level, they would age it. The Jackson Brewery that we're in right now, it was one of those breweries that was part of kind of a big lager explosion in brewing here in Cincinnati that started, in the 1850s.
Most of the beer was consumed locally, but soon the German lager's popularity was spreading far beyond the city limits.
It was sending a lot of what was made here down to New Orleans. So if you went to the French Quarter, good chance was it came from right here in these lagering cellars.
Demand for lager increased exponentially. Over the Rhine and the city of Cincinnati experienced an economic boom. So much so, the city earned its nickname as the beer capital of the world. But building cellars large enough to house not just fermentation tanks, but also thousands of barrels of the finished product was no easy task in the 1850s.
The magic of beer in Cincinnati is right down these steps.
Steve Hampton works for an organization dedicated to revitalizing the brewing district.
So we're 30 feet underground in the Crown Brewery cellars. They use arched stone construction. They use stone floors. They were typically built by very specialized contractors, cellar diggers. It was very hard to do, 30, 40 feet underground. You were in the middle of a dense urban neighborhood where there were people working and living and playing literally right next to you.
But brewers soon realized that their underground recipe for success had a lethal side effect. Fermentation produces significant amounts of carbon dioxide. Built-up CO2 would not only make these tunnels off-limits for people, it would also starve the fermenting process of oxygen and slow or even stop the production of beer.
They built these series of ventilation shafts. They look like fireplaces, but they're actually ventilation shafts that led out to the street in conjunction with the vent shafts at the top. And so with a series of metal doors on the outside, they could actually use the natural stack effect and let the warm air out of this space and keep fresh air in here.
Ventilation solved the carbon dioxide problem, but keeping the cellars cold enough for the lager fermentation process needed further innovation.
Early on, they would use ice that they would harvest from the lakes and the rivers and the canals and literally cut that in blocks, pack it away with the barrels of beer down here.
There's a lot of cons to ice. It's expensive, it's unpredictable, it also melts, and that creates all sorts of problems. So they started using artificial refrigeration as soon as that was possible. And when they did, there would have been lines crisscrossing through here, and it was ammonia that was run through those lines.
While the early brewers had addressed the temperature issue, they unknowingly introduced another complication.
Ammonia remains a very effective coolant. We don't use it today because it will kill you.
They would oftentimes have ammonia leaks from the cooling systems that would kill draft horses. It could even overcome the workers down here.
Coolant leaks were just one of the many dangers facing workers in Cincinnati's underground breweries.
They were often at risk of being injured by rolling kegs or kegs falling down, massive kegs of a couple 100 pounds each, breaking legs and ankles. Beer was part of your pay, and so often you were drinking while you were on the job, and so drinking and old cellars weren't always the most conducive to safety, and so we had a lot of accidents that way.
As Cincinnati approached the end of the 19th century, the popularity of lager showed no signs of slowing. And as building techniques improved, so bigger and bigger cellars could be created.
So we're in what remains of the original Hoodlepult Brewery. And this doesn't look like the typical cellars. It's not this arched stone that we see in the earlier cellars. It would have been here originally, but as breweries grew and changed, they modified the brewery as they needed to. So they converted this structure to steel and concrete. There's other parts of the brewery that are cast iron, brick arches in between those. So you really see a lot of variety as these breweries continue to grow and evolve.
As the breweries continued to boom, they managed to adapt and prosper. But by the turn of the century, global upheaval was about to cast a dark shadow over Cincinnati's beer-making industry.
All of this industry and all of this culture, it really all starts to collapse all at once.
In the 19th century, innovations in beer making required breweries to undergo major upgrades. Cincinnati was at the forefront of these changes.
Pasteurization in 1864, that's a big deal. You don't have to consume it immediately without it spoiling. We then get into technology around steel. So we go from wooden vats to big metal tanks that are easier to clean and get the bacteria out of. And we also start to see revolutions in glass. And then in 1892, we have the Crown bottle cap.
Despite these investments, society was changing, and the industry was in for a rude awakening.
A few things happen that actually wind up wrecking the original culture of Over the Rhine. The United States enters World War I in 1917. When that happens, all of that Germanness that made Over the Rhine such a unique European-feeling place, that all becomes bad. So that's really the first blow. Prohibition goes into effect nationally in 1920, and so all of this industry and all of this culture, it really all starts to collapse all at once.
By 1918, laws were passed forcing breweries to shut down, and for many years after, things looked bleak for the Over-the-Rhine district. Some beer makers tried to survive by brewing illegally, but police raids crushed most efforts. Soon, Cincinnati breweries were almost a thing of the past. Now, decades later, there has been a recent drive to revive the area. Combined with a new popularity for high-quality craft beer, the Over-the-Rhine district is being brought back to life. Breweries are reopening, and the community is once again embracing its vibrant past. As the tunnels and cellars get renovated, unexpected discoveries have been made.
We found a new access to tunnels that have been sealed up for over 100 years here in Cincinnati.
Brett Coleman Baker is a chemical engineer turned craft brewer now operating in Over-the-Rhine. He's found an unusual use for the decaying contents of the cellars.
These tunnels were discovered 3-4 years ago when the new tenants bought the building. They punched this hole out, and what did they discover besides a massive pile of rubble and a big freaking hole in the ground? Get your lights on. It's a little dark down here. So, this is the F&J Link Brewery lager tunnels. Look at this. What we have here is the top of a barrel. You let it ferment, then you let it lager, which is aging.
Brett realized that the original wooden fermenting tanks could still be harboring life in their timbers.
Yeast lives up to 1 inch deep in wood. There's a really good chance that this yeast has sporulated, which means that it is in a hard shell, and it can basically just hibernate for as long as it wants in that until it gets dropped into liquid conducive to its growth. So we're talking sugar, we're talking nutrients.
Brett took swabs from the Link Brewery as soon as he was able to get in and sent them off to a lab in Chicago.
We're gonna scrape into it a little bit. We don't need to go deep, we just need to go deep enough to avoid any mold spores. We want yeast, which is a fungus, but we want the good fungus, not the bad fungus. We're gonna swab the tip. One swab. Now, it doesn't look like we got anything to the naked eye, but that doesn't matter because we just need a tiny little spore that you're not even gonna see. We're gonna dip it into our jar, seal it back up, and hopefully get something good out of it. And we're done. Hopefully, we caught some yeast.
Of 100 swabs taken, one successfully picked up spores of brewer's yeast, tiny microorganisms that had survived in the barrels for over a century.
Being able to get a piece of living history that survived from before Prohibition here in Cincinnati is just, it just fills me with joy.
The yeast spores were grown under controlled lab conditions and returned to Brett to create a brand new 100-year-old beer. Today, craft breweries are on the rise across the UK and the US. But in Cincinnati, it's more than a trend. It's a tradition that dates back more than 150 years. On the south coast of Denmark, overlooking the Baltic Sea, is a cliff face hiding both military and prehistoric mysteries.
We're ready if you decide to attack us.
Carved directly into the rock is an impenetrable fortress with more than a mile of underground passageways, tough enough to withstand a nuclear bomb.
Shock waves from a nuclear blast would be deflected.
As the Cold War escalated, this base was equipped with the latest technology, built to be right on the front line.
Science with special forces climbed up the cliff outside.
In the late 1940s, Denmark was reeling from the impact of the Second World War. It had only recently been liberated from Nazi control, and the country desperately wanted to rebuild. But just as one war ended, another was beginning. As political and military tensions grew between the East and the West, NATO called upon Denmark to play a major role in the Cold War as the first line of defense from Russia's Red Banner fleet.
Denmark was sometimes called the guardian of the Baltic. Usually people just say the cork in the Baltic, because Baltic is kind of like the bubble and there's these really narrow straits you have to get out of the Baltic.
Iben Bjørnsen is a historian and curator at the Stensfort Museum. She works to preserve the memory of the crucial role played by this cork in the Baltic.
In 1949, Denmark joined NATO, and with that it was solidified in a future war. The enemy would be the Soviet Union. The Soviet Baltic fleet was their main fleet. In a war, they would have to move that fleet through the Danish Straits and out into the open sea. So the purpose of Stensfort was to close off the sound. Denmark's task was to hold the cork in and prevent the entire Baltic fleet from coming out into the Atlantic. That was a pretty important task.
All-out war could erupt at any moment, and there was nothing protecting Denmark from the enemy. The Stensfort would be the first to know about an imminent attack, and it would be their job to alert the world.
Sometimes for British, but especially Americans, for them the actual battlefield in a war was something far away. You have the enemy right there. This really is on the front line of the Cold War, but also would be on the front line of an actual war.
Stensfort was intentionally constructed so the Danish could not only see an attack starting, but potentially have a chance to intervene.
You would have sea mines sort of covering this stretch of water, and then you would have the big guns. Now, these two guns were to support the minefields and shoot down the minesweepers, which would be sent in advance. Denmark alone would not stand a chance against the Soviet fleet. The task for Denmark within NATO was to hold the line for long enough for reinforcement to come from the west.
Building a subterranean fortress capable of withstanding the first strikes of enemy aggression was crucial. But unlike other Cold War military complexes, Stensford had one huge advantage.
Fire!
Strategically located on Denmark's southern coast, the Stensford was in prime position to monitor the Baltic Sea during the Cold War. Any maritime vessel, friend or foe, passed under its watchful eye. No expense was spared in building the fort.
With all the tunnels and nooks and crannies, it's 1.7 kilometers. It's built in two nearly identical sections to support the two big guns on the surface, each section supporting one gun.
An attack was considered so likely that when building the fort, the tunnel layout was designed with a breach in mind.
Where we're standing now, you can see the hallway, it makes sort of a little bend or a little break. And that's because if the enemy takes one section, he's not able to stand down there and shoot into the other section.
What was unique to Stensford, in comparison to other military bases around the world, is that its existence wasn't classified. NATO wanted the communists to know it was there.
The Russians were also supposed to know that we had a military installation waiting for them here, pointing out towards the Baltic, and we're ready if you decide to attack us.
When determining where to locate their cork in the Baltic, Denmark chose this site for several reasons. Possibly the most important is that it could withstand a nuclear blast.
Fire!
Answers to how and why can be found 66 million years ago.
You can see it has different layers of limestone, flint.
Dr. Jesper Milan has spent his career studying the geology of Stensford. The rock formations along this coast are unique in their specific makeup, and it was no mistake that this was the location selected for the construction of Stensford.
The limestone is quite porous and flexible, and the flint is very solid, like glass. So that makes a sandwich construction that actually makes it a very, very strong cliffside. And the idea was that the shock waves from a nuclear blast would be deflected by these sandwich layers here, and that should bomb-proof the Stevns fortress.
The impact resistance of the rock is the result of several fortuitous stages in its evolution.
If you see it from a distance, we can see the layers are curving. They're curving in big mound-like structures. That's actually the old shape of the seafloor 66 million years ago. All the white chalk here, the skeletal remains of tiny, tiny animals that lived on the seafloor at that time. And then they died, the skeletons collapsed, new grew on top of them, more skeletons collapsed, forming big, big layers of limestone through time. The flint layers are actually very, very interesting. They are composed of tiny needles from sponges, the most unlikely animal to form a solid rock. These sponges had a skeleton of glass needles, and when they died, the glass needles dissolved and crystallized in the seafloor, forming these big layers of flint.
If the fortress was under nuclear attack, the alternating layers would behave like a mattress, gradually bending, absorbing, and dissipating the shockwaves. Should war strike Stensford, the base had to remain operational. This required it to be equipped with the very latest in surveillance technology.
And this is the heart of the underground. If war broke out, you would have your operations center down here. This was really top-of-the-line electronic surveillance gear in the 80s. Red ships are Warsaw Pact ships, of course. The blue ships are our own NATO ships. The green ships are civilian, and the white ships are unidentified. This is where you would have your overview of all traffic going through the Sound.
Throughout the Cold War, there were times when tensions nearly boiled over into full-on conflict.
During some of the major crises, this place went into high alert, which means lockdown. Cuban Missile Crisis was one. You had people down here for a week and a half. Hungary, 1956 was another, and Czechoslovakia, 1968 was another. You would have the order clear fort, which means everyone is underground. You don't get radio signals down here, you didn't get newspapers, so they would just basically receive no news. I imagine that would have been quite scary.
Despite the depth of the fortress, there were risks inside and out, none more so than the Russian Navy, who remained unnervingly close.
We were very close out there. Sometimes you could spit on the deck, actually.
Visible to all the world, Stensford was constantly under threat during the Cold War. Troops stationed here knew that should war break out, they would likely be the very first Russian target.
I was here in the beginning of the 80s. My job down here was as electronic technician, maintain all the electronic equipment, radars.
Brian Hector Sorensen is a retired naval officer who served at Stensford.
In the beginning, I was some years at the Danish torpedo boats. We were very close out there. The Russians, sometimes you could spit on the deck, actually. So it was a very tense situation sometimes. The Polish crisis started when I was here.
The Polish crisis began in 1981 with a worker uprising and threatened the communist stronghold in the country. As the Soviet Union planned a military intervention, naval activity greatly increased right on Denmark's doorstep.
Rumors that the Russians had put a bottle of vodka in the foxhole outside. It also said that there are signs with us, special forces had climbed up the cliff outside.
Stensford went into lockdown in anticipation of an attack.
This escalated, and Russian ships coming in the waters around Poland. Standing here by the bunks for the people in the operational room. In case of a hot situation, the fort could be closed down for 30 days. People in the fort could not come out and were forced to sleep here.
During the lockdown, food and water had to be readily available and a secure power supply maintained.
If war were to break out, you knew that relatively fast the main power lines would be cut. The fort is built to be self-sufficient for 3 months. That's why you had your emergency generator, and that runs on diesel oil.
The troops below ground were on constant alert.
This room was where I was normally stationed when I was on duty, when in shooting exercises and in a hot situation. This room is the radio room. It was a restricted area where only cleared people were allowed for security reasons. You could say this room is the heart of the Stensford. This is where everything is controlled. 30 people was on duty all time down here.
One of the most important jobs was operating the formidable cannons aimed at the narrow passes of the Øresund Strait.
This is the ammunition magazine. Here we have carrying the grenades with a fuse, 6 at a time, 6 each minute. Different types of grenades, about 500 of them.
The guns had a colossal range, but they needed to be fired accurately if they were to be effective. It was a multi-step process.
This room is the heart of the artillery system. It's mechanical, it's an analog mechanical computer. There's no electronics in it. And all the basic data is put in by these handles. Then I use to calculate the trace of the grenade.
Inside the gun, you could have a crew of 18 people in here. Here we have the main gunner, and then you would have people manning sort of each side. This is actually the main barrel. Down here, you can climb all the way down to the underground.
With the threat of the Cold War and nuclear warfare looming over Stensford, It was fitting that during construction, scientists discovered this site was no stranger to devastation.
This tiny clay layer here contains an element called iridium, which is extremely rare on the Earth. But this layer here contains more than 60 times the amount of iridium that could normally occur on Earth. That caused the scientists to study it to suggest that Earth was hit by a big asteroid. They calculated it must have been around 10 kilometers in diameter. That's bigger than Mount Everest. And that hit the Earth 66 million years ago. In Denmark, we call this layer the fish clay because they found the fish skeletons in it. The fish clay contains the dust that engulfed the Earth when the asteroid hit and blocked out the sunlight, causing a global nuclear winter and caused a big mass extinction. Dinosaurs and more than half of the life on Earth became extinct.
Thankfully, the Cold War never escalated to the point that the Stensfort's powerful defenses had to be put into action. By the early 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed. And without an enemy to defend against, the fort was eventually closed in 2000. Its role now is to serve as a memory of the Cold War on a front line that few knew about. The cliffs surrounding the fortress are evidence of one extinction event. The fortress itself, evidence of an extinction event avoided. In the northwest of England lies the city of Liverpool. Beneath the Mersey River is one of the greatest man-made engineering achievements of the 20th century. Over 2.3 kilometers long, it was unprecedented for its time.
Nobody had seen anything of this scale before.
Prior to being known as the home of the Beatles, the global port of Liverpool was experiencing growing pains. Traveling from one side of the Mersey to the other required ferries and lots of time. The growing popularity of cars meant people needed a quicker way to do business, and engineers had the answer.
It's all done by hand-picked, small explosives.
So how did the tunnel's designers figure out how to beat the river at its own game?
It was very, very difficult to control the groundwater.
For centuries, ships transporting goods across the world have navigated the River Mersey into the port of Liverpool. The river was also a vital means of moving goods and people locally.
In the early 1900s, everything had to come across by ferry, people, livestock, horses and carts.
But by the 1920s, use of motor vehicles was increasing exponentially, and engineers searched for a solution to a new phenomenon called a traffic jam. In 1922 alone, 640,000 cars trying to get from Liverpool across the Mersey to Birkenhead caused chaos.
The traffic was building up either side of the river, and something had to be done.
Local engineers got to work, attempting to solve a problem that no one in the world had successfully done yet. Sir Archibald Salvage, one of the city's engineers at the time, appointed a committee to tackle the infrastructure problem. The committee proposed two options: build a bridge or dig a tunnel.
The bridge was a really expensive option compared to a tunnel. They also knew, having come out of the First World War, that a bridge across the river would be a target for enemy bombers.
After several years of debate, the committee voted for a tunnel. The next challenge was to find an engineering genius who could build it. Determined to keep the traffic flowing freely into the city of Liverpool, Salvage asked the government for financial support to build the tunnel.
Chancellor of the Exchequer was Winston Churchill, when they agreed to fund it to the tune of £2.5 million. Sir Archibald Salvage appointed Sir Basil Mott, who was one of the real titans of British engineering at the time, to lead on the project.
Sir Basil Mott had overseen some of the country's largest engineering feats, including bridges over the Thames and installing the first escalators into London's underground. But nothing would surpass the enormous engineering challenge he was about to face.
If there's some joint or fault of the lock, the water can come through that joint, so it can make some severe damage or severe failure of the tunnel.
In the early 20th century, England was just learning how to deal with a new phenomenon called traffic. In Liverpool, engineers were attempting to combat this problem by building an underwater tunnel on a scale that had never been attempted before. Dr. Hyun Jun Seo of the University of Liverpool has worked on some of the UK's biggest tunneling projects.
Underground water excavation is very difficult. 100 years ago, it was very difficult to control the groundwater. Under the river, the soil or rock condition is much softer. So during the tunneling, the water pressure control is one of the important parts.
The plan was to build a 2.3-kilometre tunnel under the River Mersey. But with no modern equipment at their disposal, the excavation alone was a dangerous undertaking.
This tunnel was all dug by hand, 1,700 men working on it at its peak, and it's all done by hand picks, small explosives.
Engineers decided to start with 2 exploratory pilot tunnels on each side of the river to make sure conditions were safe to continue digging. The goal was for the 2 tunnels to eventually meet in the middle.
To accurately meet in the middle, they had a depth measuring stick, which they would shine the light across to the next depth measuring stick and make sure that they were coming out at the same level each time.
After 3 years of backbreaking work, on April the 3rd, 1928, the 2 teams met under the river.
When they met in the middle, they were less than an inch out, so it was very accurate work back then.
Even though the pilot tunnels were a success, plans called for the main tunnels to be enlarged, meaning tunnelers had to dig both up and down. And soon, only a meter of rock stood between the workers and the raging river above. Modern underground construction uses boring machines to seal the tunnels as they go. But workers in the early 20th century had rudimentary technology to keep the mighty River Mersey at bay. More than 1.1 million tons of rock needed to be excavated and removed. Experimentation was necessary to find the best solution to waterproof the walls.
We make a borehole and we take a sample and we know all the ground condition before the tunnel construction, like underground mapping. However, 100 years ago, they don't know the ground condition very well.
Workers installed 100,000 cast iron linings, weighing more than 63,000 tons, all by hand to support the tunnel.
If there's some joint or fault of the lock, the water can come through that joint, so it can make some severe damage or severe failure of the tunnel.
But water wasn't the only issue engineers had to deal with. In the early 20th century, lead engineer Sir Basil Mott's groundbreaking designs for the Mersey Tunnel had managed to protect the tunnel and its crew from the river. His next challenge was to rid the tunnel of lethal exhaust fumes. Combustion engines were passing under the Mersey at a rate of 4,000 per hour. The risk of a catastrophic disaster was high. Sir Basil Mott needed to devise an ingenious plan, or this airflow issue could threaten the entire project. Using a mixture of longitudinal and transverse ventilation, they designed a unique system to vent toxic fumes from the tunnel.
The air is now coming down from the fresh air fan, and it comes down the shaft and it meets these walls. These walls we call our banana walls because they're curved.
The longitudinal system funneled air along channels running parallel to the road. It was then diverted away and the air filtered.
The air's come round the corner along this air invert. To get it on the road deck, you've got this series of holes on the underside. So the air travels up through those, hits a U-shaped structure which sends it off across the road deck at about exhaust level.
The transverse ventilation used a system of ducts in the walls and ceilings to inject air and remove exhaust gases.
The fresh air comes through under the pavement. That air pushes the polluted air through that exhaust duct.
To sustain this system over a 2.5-kilometer underwater tunnel required serious power, capable of delivering 71,000 cubic meters of fresh air every minute and withdrawing the same amount.
This huge fan, it's 28 feet wide, weighs 25 tons. It can actually create a wind speed of about 36 miles an hour. The building had to be built around them because of the sheer size of them.
Having overcome this mammoth undertaking, on the 18th of July 1934, the tunnel was officially opened by King George VI.
This tunnel was actually described as the 8th wonder of the world when it opened because nothing had been built on this scale before. People came on holiday to Liverpool just to drive through the tunnel because they'd never experienced driving underwater before.
Not only was it deemed the longest and largest tunnel ever attempted beneath a major body of water, it was by far the most modern and technologically advanced. 2 underwater junctions would service 4 lanes of traffic under the Mersey, between 2 entry and exit points on either side of the river.
The Mersey Tunnels is a 24-hour operation. It never sleeps.
Today, Liverpool has a dedicated team to maintain this massive underwater transit system. Paul Heaton is one of the engineers taking on this crucial role.
The workmanship back in the 1920s and 1930s of the original builders of the tunnel was fantastic. It's left us with a really good structure to maintain.
Yet the power of the river surrounding the tunnel is relentless, and every day water leaks through.
Underneath us now is a huge sump. It spans the width of the Queensway Tunnel. This pump manages to pump out 145 metres cube of water every minute, pushed out by the pump into the main sewers in Birkenhead.
If these pumps fail, disaster will likely follow.
The water would fill up the sumps and it would actually fill up these rooms. We wouldn't have a tunnel because it would be underwater.
But a lot has changed since the tunnel first opened. During its first year, nearly 2 million vehicles passed through. Today, 12.8 million vehicles travel safely through the Mersey Tunnel every year. This groundbreaking tunnel is key to the economic success of the area. The ambition and engineering prowess of the early 20th century builders who dared to tame the Mersey is nothing short of inspiring and remains truly impressive by 21st century standards.